Right, we're coming up to the end of the 10 commandments here. We got commandment 7 tonight, and then we'll do 8 through 10 next week. So we are getting ready to wrap up the 10 commandments. Let's start it with a prayer. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. God in heaven, we give you glory and thanks for this beautiful day. And thank you for all my friends that are with me tonight. And thank you for your 10 commandments. I know they have landed me in the confessional here a couple of times, but Father said, if I was really paying attention to the commandments, I should be in the confessional. So I was, but it's a humbling experience. I know we're to be perfect like our Heavenly Father, but that's a hard call. We're all trying our best, and we are so thankful that you are merciful and that you love us and you smile as long as we're trying. So we will keep trying, Lord. We will keep trying. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, we'll share the screen and get moving with, it says commandment 6, but we really are on commandment 7, you shall not steal. And so we're going to start out with paragraphs 503 through 505, which kind of give us, as always, a little introduction to what the 7th commandment requires. When we talk about not stealing, we have to kind of define some terms. The 7th commandment talks about the universal destination and distribution of goods and the private ownership of them. And we're going to talk about both of these terms. Both of them are good things. Universal destination and distribution of goods is good, and so is the private ownership of them. The private ownership is what guarantees human freedom and dignity of each individual and whatever family they have associated with them, because it assures the security of their life. Right? If you have a little plot of land, you can do what I did tonight. You can plant a little garden. You'll have a place for shelter from the weather. You'll have a place that you can call your own and where you feel that you're safe. And the church says that's extraordinarily important. And to have that freedom there where you can do things like study religion, make free choices about how you're going to worship. And the church says that that right for private ownership exists if it's acquired or received in a just way. So needless to say, if you go out and get something unjustly, either by stealing it or, doing it in some illegal manner, then you don't have the right to private ownership. But it's an important thing in order for us to execute what God gave us, which is to be made in his image and likeness, to have free will so that we can choose and to know God. Private ownership, though, it's kind of, you call it private ownership, but it's really stewardship of God's goods. He gives them to us and we can use them as our private property. But when we do, we should be asking ourselves the questions, where does God want me to use this? How do I make it fruitful? How do I make it a benefit to others? I used to always joke with people, since I was talking about my garden. I had a garden in Nebraska too, and I love to can, and so I would can vegetable soup. But canning vegetable soup is kind of painful because you have to clean all the vegetables and mix them all together, cut them off the cob if you're using corn, do all these things. So it's kind of hard work. And so I would give away canned goods that were easy to make, but I would never give away my vegetable soup. And so one day my best friend there in Nebraska asked me, well, why aren't you giving us any of that Campbell or any of that soup? And I'm like, Well, because it's so hard to make, right? Which is wrong. Right? I'm a stewardship of God's goods. He gives me the good health to be able to make vegetable soup. I can give a little bit of it away to my friends. But see, that's how we should think about with all of our private property. And of course, when I started thinking about it, I was like, man, I probably end up in the confessional again. Do we really share our 200 acres as much as we could? Do I share my house as much as I could? um it's just that thought process that I am a steward of it. It's not really something I hoard. Now, the universal destination of goods, if you wanted to define that, it is the whole of the world's resources are made to satisfy the whole of the world's needs. And even if one country has more natural gas or more oil or more gold or more silver or more iron ore, right? The fact that it lies in your country does not mean that it should only be distributed in your country. That's what the universal destination of goods means, that and where basic needs are concerned, like food, shelter, etc., that actually takes precedence over private property. So like hoarding up food for the end times, like you read about sometimes in the newspaper, magazine, Jesus would give that a big thumbs down, right? Because there are people who are starving in the world right now. Now, there are all sorts of logistic problems with getting the food distributed so that everybody can eat. But that's why he gave us intellect and rationality and the way to figure out problems, right? But we always have to be taking that into account, that it's things are made to be used to bring up everybody's level of life, not just one nation, one state, one county, whatever. The seventh commandment also requires respect for persons and their property, right? You have this right to private property, but you have to also be responsible for not going and stealing somebody else's property or interfering with somebody's private domain. You also have to have respect for the integrity of creation. And the Vatican has taken a much more sharper look at this ever since Pope John Paul II. He kind of started talking about, as the church is concerned, taking care of the environment. Benedict XVI talked about it even more and actually wrote something about it in an encyclical. And then St. Francis has not Francis of Assisi, but Pope Francis has issued a couple of different encyclicals talking about how we need to care for the environment, that God created the earth and it's not within our purview to destroy it for our own personal reasons. So the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal, is the basis for the social doctrine of the church that involves the correct way of acting in economic, social, and political life. And it's also the basis for the right and duty of human labor and for the justice and solidarity that nations should have in order to do this universal destination of goods. And we're going to talk about each of those as we go along. Last but not least, there's love for the poor. And the Catechism takes a special look at that because it was so high up in Jesus's heart. The virtues that let us respect the goods of others, right? We're not supposed to steal, right? That's what the commandment tells us. And the virtues that are going to help us with the universal distribution of goods and the respect of private property are justice, charity, temperance, and solidarity, right? Justice is giving each person their due. Charity is wishing the good for every single person on earth. Temperance is not getting too attached to anything worldly. And solidarity is basically the golden rule worked out amongst all human beings, and especially solidarity in the communities that we form, and nations is where the catechism's going to really look at solidarity. What those virtues will allow us to do if we allow God's grace to open up our hearts is to reserve the better part of what we have for guests, the sick, and the poor. And this is, again, as I said, I end up in the confessional. What I really think, do I really give the better part of what I have to other people? And you know, there are things like my vegetable soup that I really hoard. So yeah, that's something to work on. In the Old Testament, it was interesting because what God told us in the Old Testament, that was, you know, that 1/10 of your field should be left for the poor, for the alien, and for the sick. And the Old Testament also talked about how widows and orphans should be allowed to glean the fields after the harvest was taken. So God started talking about the virtues of just distribution very early on in the Bible. The seventh commandment requires respect for promises made and contracts agreed to. There are several paragraphs about this in the full catechism, that if you sign up to some contract, you carry it out. That if you don't, or even a handshake, right? As a promise, that's a type of thievery when you don't live up to contracts. Reparation for injustices committed. If some injustice occurs and you find out about it, you need to repair, right? Take a little kid who comes to your house and throws a rock through your window. It's one thing for him to say, I'm sorry that I broke your window, but he needs to also make reparation for that injustice of throwing the rock through it. If not, then he's breaking the seventh commandment. Restitution of stolen goods. You know, you find, even if it's not a stolen thing, like you find a wallet and there's a driver's license in it, and you need to get that person called, get their full wallet, everything that's in it, returned to them. It also requires the prudent and moderate use of mineral, vegetables, and animal resources. Right, we talked about temperance, this not being too attached to worldly goods, and being able to use them wisely. You know, today when Kathleen and we were the only ones at the gathering place, and she brought up, you know, our new ways of farming. And it's, I was just at the Lawless's house because they were chosen as the farm family of the year. And the Secretary of Agriculture for Iowa came to speak. And he was talking about how, you know, just like 30 years ago, 80% of the world's population was involved in some type of agricultural means, right? Either planting, picking, processing, canning, etc. But now that's dropped to about 3% of the population. And how do we do that? Well, now we use Roundup, we drill beans, a whole separate method that has allowed all these people to be freed from agriculture in order to go out and do other creative things. But we have to think about, how is this affecting the environment? How is it, in the one case, it's providing food for many people that wouldn't have it in other ways. But, it's always this balancing act. And that's what the church is trying to get at, with minerals, especially fossil fuels, iron ore, how do you use them in some way that you can guarantee for future generations that you'll have more? Animal resources, the same thing. Every single animal that's made, when it's living and doing what God made it to do, it gives him glory just by being alive. And it's interesting that the catechism, the full catechism, calls out a paragraph specifically to talk about pets. And it says, that it's okay to love your pet, but you can never love them like you love a human. They're not, you can want the good for an animal, but not in the same way that you want the good for a human being. And that you shouldn't waste resources on it, that should really be spent on human beings. Again, it's good to take good care of them, but I have a couple of friends who, one spent literally tens of thousands of dollars on cancer treatments for a dog. The dog was miserable. The cancer treatments were exorbitant. That's ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have a ton of money. If you have a ton of money, then take tens of thousands of dollars and give it to some charity that will help human beings in some way. The catechism just cautions against that. They also caution against the indiscriminate use of animals, especially in scientific experimentation. That yes, it's licit, it's okay to use animals for experimentation when you're trying to see if you can improve human life in some way, but that it has to be done within reason and that it can't cause unnecessary suffering for the animals. So, just because it's some curiosity or some extraordinarily horrendous experiment, which yes, we have run them on animals, the catechism cautions against it. Things that are forbidden by the seventh commandment: the taking of another's private property against the reasonable will of the owner. Now, notice how it says the reasonable will, because the owner of private property always needs to be thinking about the common good of mankind. So let's say that you have a county road that needs to go through because some new industry has been produced and has been built, and you need to get raw materials to it. And this place is going to give a bunch of new jobs. They're going to be high paying, this is really going to be a plus for the community as a whole. But the road has to run through your land, right? And you don't want it to. Well, at this point, the church would say, yes, the community has the right to take the private property, right, of eminent domain. They don't talk about it that way in the catechism, but that is why they use that word, reasonable will of the owner, because the owner should be looking out for the common good. So it would go in many types of eminent domain type questions, pipelines, schools, etc. So things that would fall under this taking of another's private property, a lot of them, the first one you think of, theft, right? You go and steal something from somebody. But how about unjust wages? That's a type of thievery. If you're an employer and you don't pay your employees a just wage, that's thievery. Speculation on the value of goods to take advantage of others. I always think about, since we just had some tornadoes here, it made me think about hurricanes when I came across this, and how lots of times power gets wiped out and people load up semi trucks full of generators and they take them down and sell them at exorbitant prices. Same can go when you have problems with starvation and people get food, but then they sell it at enormous prices because they know that they can get whatever they ask. That's thievery. Tax evasion is thievery. Business fraud. Damaging private or public property that's not your own private property. That's thievery. Usury, where somebody says, I just can't make the payment on my house this week. Could I borrow some money? And you lend it to them, but you lend it to them at an exorbitant interest rate. What a lot of credit card companies do now is usury. Kathleen was saying this morning that she's heard of credit card interest rates that are now as high as 39%. And the people that are given those types of credit cards are usually the ones who can least afford 39% interest. The church would say that's thievery. Corruption, private abuse of common goods. Say your employer has a great big vat of ink pens that you all get to use and paper and stuff, but your kids are getting ready to go to school. And so you decide to take home a bunch of paper and ink pens, even though the company has explicitly said, don't do this. That's thievery. Deliberately doing poor work. You get mad at your boss. And so you decide to sabotage whatever it is that you're working on. That falls under the seventh commandment, as does waste. I saw it was probably a decade ago now, or 2 decades ago. I was at home with my mother, and she liked to watch Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah we were in a slump in the economy. Everybody was having trouble making ends meet. So Oprah had volunteered to go to help people figure out how to spend less money. So she went to this woman's house, and the woman had 2 daughters and a husband. And she explained to Oprah, though, that none of her family liked leftovers and none of them ate the same thing. So every night she prepared 3 meals, and she threw away the excess from all 3 meals. And then we went to the girls' closet, and instead of having a shirt in, a red shirt of one style, there was this like whole stacks of shirts in all different colors because the girls couldn't decide which color they liked best. And so, right, that's the kind of waste that that the church is talking about. To waste natural resources like that is forbidden by, well, those aren't natural resources, but to waste things is violating the 7th commandment. The church's teaching on social doctrine. We said that social doctrine falls under the 7th commandment, a lot of it, that you shall not steal. And it was developed from the gospel, the church's teaching on social doctrine, and it concerns the dignity of the human person. And Leo XIII was really the first pope to talk about it in the 18th century, and it was a response to the Industrial Revolution. It's not that human beings hadn't been used before. They had been, right, when you went back into the Dark Ages, and you had serfs that were working on land, and really they weren't slaves, but they weren't treated right. But the Industrial Revolution brought this about in a new and a much more heinous way, right? At least the serfs were on the surface of the earth and in the sunshine and work in the fields. People that were now being like little children that were being forced to work in the coal mines, and they liked them because they were small and could get into small crevices, and child labor. I mean, and tremendously unsafe conditions in these new factories that were being built to mass produce things. So the church started to come up with its social doctrine and talk about social justice. So she makes moral judgments on social and economic matters when the fundamental rights of persons, the common good, or the salvation of souls requires it. And you know, with the salvation of souls, she was looking at those people who were building the industries and getting enormously rich off the backs of poor people. Common good, right? What was the common good back then, and the rights of these individuals who were being drawn in to these industries? The church said that the human person should be the author, center, and goal of economic and social life. That economic life is not meant solely to multiply goods produced and increase profit or power. It's ordered, first of all, to the service of persons, the whole man, the entire human community. So there are industries, right, that are making scads of money that don't fit any of these requirements of the church. Let's think about pornography, the porn industry, right? Totally detrimental. The only person that's profiting from it are those who are at the top producing the pornography. Drug pushers, illegal drug manufacturers, right, who are selling what is the word I'm looking for right now? I wanted to say morphine, but morphine's actually used legally. And so is fentanyl, but now fentanyl's this huge problem. Methamphetamines is probably what I was thinking of when I couldn't think of the word, right? There's another industry, the illegal drug industry, that is actually harming the common good and the entire whole man and the human community. And the church is like, you know, and then you get borderline industries, but it's something that somebody in industry, if they're a Christian, should be thinking about, not just about increased profit or making a zillion of these things, but am I doing something good for the universal community? It's the church's teaching on social doctrine provides principles for reflection, criteria for judgment, norms and guidelines for action. If you read encyclicals of Leo III, and about every 20 years, 10 to 20 years, the popes will again issue something on social doctrine that will have these criteria and guidelines. Social justice requires society giving all persons who make it up their due. The church herself attempts to stay out of the methods of implementation, right? She'll tell you whether it's good or bad. How do you figure out if this is really socially just or not, whether you're giving people their due? And she'll give some norms or guidelines for, well, how can you make sure that it is a good? But she won't say how to do it, because that's not her bailiwick. That is the bailiwick of the laity. Her advice, when you look at the big picture, is be Christ-like. But like a good bride, she offers specifics too. and she can get pretty darn harpy. I was surprised really when I read the full catechism. I have been on every single commandment at the norms and just the scope of the commandment. But again, whenever the church thinks that salvation of souls or the common good or the rights of the human person and their dignity is concerned, she'll give you some guidelines. She'll give you some criteria to judge. One of the things that the church says is that as a Catholic, you can definitely disagree on policies, but you shouldn't disagree on principles. Take illegal immigration, right? All those immigrants coming across the border are looking for a better life. They are looking for some way to shelter, feed, and make a living for their family. All of that we can agree on, that they have a dignity as a human person, that they deserve those things. But now we can disagree on the policy about how do we help to ensure that they get that universal distribution of goods. Should we build a border wall with just a small gate, and let people in and check them each out one by one? Should we build some communities, work with Mexico and build some great big huge holding communities? You could come up with a million different policies. Congress seems to not be able to come up with one that they can pass, but you can disagree on those policies, but on the principle that those are human persons with dignity who deserve some form of justice, that the church would say you can't really disagree on that point. Economic and social systems opposed to the social doctrine of the church. Number one, any kind of social system or political system that sacrifices the basic human rights of people, like our freedom to choose, right? God he gave us that. That makes us in his image. So if you take away the basic human rights of people, their freedom of speech, right? All of the Bill of Rights, what it lists. Well, the places that do that, communism, number one, right? You can't have private property. The church says private property is a good. And in fact, that you can't have human freedom without it. Communism says, no, I'm the state. I will have all the property and I will distribute it equally, right? Wrong. They never do. Do you think that Putin lives like the rest of Russians? We know that's not true. We look at the Russian oligarchs, right? When they started going around and seizing their boats that were as big as almost as aircraft carriers. I mean, and they had satellite systems and swimming pools on board. They were like a cruise ship, right? They don't distribute the goods. And atheistic and totalitarian forms of socialism, same-o, same-o. Socialism oftentimes starts out as looking like it's a pretty good thing. We think of Robin Hood, right? Steal from the rich, give to the poor, but it always ends up the same because of original sin. The poor who are stealing from the rich become the rich, and the rich usually are killed. That's what has happened in places like Cambodia, Pol Pot. Remember how he took all the teachers, scientists, etc., put them in the fields and killed them, and hence we have the killing fields. Socialism, and the church doesn't say that you can't have a good form of socialism, and that's the problem. People get mad at the church because she tries to hold things in tension, that some good form of religious socialism can work. in like religious communities where all things are shared. We think in the Bible of Jerusalem, right? All the apostles went out after Christ's resurrection to beg money for the Jews in Jerusalem who were being persecuted. But they all lived in common. Also, economic systems that make profit the exclusive norm or ultimate end, the church says, those are also evil. So capitalism's self-centered individualism, where, and it's not with all people. I mean, there are some very good industries out there who do profit sharing, who really care about their employees and try to take care of them. But there are other capitalistic enterprises that are not so. And the church says that this absolute primacy of the laws of the marketplace over human labor are just a no-go. And it was interesting when Father Mike Schmitz was doing his catechism in a year, he mentioned a quote by John Adams that I went ahead and looked up. Just because it seemed so pertinent to today's situation in our country. John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." It can't, see, the thing is, the Constitution assumes that you have to answer to a higher God, that even if this particular law is not written, that you won't do it because there's a higher law that you will live to. And as religion has fallen to the back seat and legalism has raised its ugly head, now you have to have a law for everything. And then you have these huge court cases where you argue, who broke this law, which side are you on? John Adams, who was, one of the penners there and signers of the Constitution, said it's inadequate to govern people who already are not moral people. And so that's fascinating. You shall not steal. The seventh commandment also talks about the laborer and the worker. Work is a duty and a right by which we collaborate with God, the Creator. He did make us for leisure, but he also made us for work. And of course, ultimately to give him glory. So how do we give him glory through our work? Well, by honoring the gifts and the talents that he gave us. To provide for ourselves and our family and to serve the human community. I think right off the bat because June's with us, and I think of the beautiful quilts that she makes, right? There is something that serves the human community. She's not making a living for her family off of it, but you have writers, you have politicians, you have farmers who know how to raise crops and how to get them to market. You have these gifts that God's given you, and it's not only your right to work in these areas, but it's actually your duty to collaborate with God. St. Paul also points out that if anyone will not work, let him not eat, when he was talking about social systems, right? And Andy just read something to me. How the Albion newspaper always does a back in time section? Well, it was like in the 1930s, and it was talking about community gardens, and it was asking people to donate some land because they'd run out of land for a community garden. And that and it said, if you were going to get welfare, you had to have a community garden. You had to plant it and you had to produce produce in it, or you wouldn't get money from the government. That you also still had to be working, even though at that time, because we were in the Depression, they realized there's not enough work to go around, so people do need money. But You're going to be working at the same time. And I just kind of, it reminded me of St. Paul. With God's grace, right? We need his free gift. We need to have him in our heart as we accomplish this work. It becomes a means of sanctification and collaboration with Christ for the salvation of others, regardless of what we do, right? When Jesus was in the world, he was a worker. The Greek word that's used to describe his type of work is usually translated carpenter, but it actually covers a broader area. It also would include masonry. And Father Mike was like, we don't really know if Jesus worked with wood or whether he worked with stone. But we do know that near Nazareth, where he was raised and where Joseph would have taught him this trade, that they were building a city. And Father Schmidt just said, would it be interesting if really what his job was to carry rocks from Nazareth to this city that was being built? I mean, Jesus humbled himself, right? The Son of God comes down. Okay, maybe he's making tables and chairs and, or carpentry type things that we usually think of, but maybe he's just really carrying rocks, right? But he's doing it for the salvation of others. And that's how all of our work is supposed to be done, as a gift to the community. The church talks about employment that needs to be open to all, with respect for free economic initiative and fair compensation. So no discrimination, sex, color, whatever. It has to be open to all. And that's just part, again, of being a Christian. Things that the state should regulate and guarantee for laborers: obviously individual freedom, private property, right? These two things right here, since this is what the state should guarantee for laborers, that's what marks out communism and totalitarian socialism. As soon as you take away people's individual freedom and their right to private property, you no longer have a social doctrine that meets the requirements of Jesus Christ. Should work on a stable currency, efficient public services, oversee the direct exercise of human rights in the economic sector to make sure that industries aren't doing what they did at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I just remember when I worked at the nuclear plant, we used to have people come in who would get jobs at the plant, and they'd come out of the meat packing industry. And I taught a course on industrial safety called Human Performance. And these guys would always say how glad they were to get into the nuclear plant, because we did have extraordinary safety requirements and we enforced them. And you got in a lot of trouble if you broke any of them. And in the meat packing plant, they were like, oh my gosh, every day somebody was losing a finger, a hand, they were stumbling over something and hitting their head. That there was just no enforcement of any kind of safety requirements in that industry, at least around where we were. So the church would say, yes, the state should be looking in on this economic sector to make sure that it's meeting the needs of its laborers, keeping them paid right, fairly, that their lives are not made to work in an unsafe environment. And in some cases, it says even help their citizens find work. The business manager's role. Well, he's responsible for the economic and ecological effects of their operations. So yes, they want to make a profit, but they don't want to make a profit by destroying the environment. When I was young, Andy still calls me a granola. Because I remember, when Love Canal caught on fire because of the excessive pollution in it, the chemicals, all the trash, it just started to burn. And and industries weren't being held responsible. In Montana, strip mining, where you just go up and strip open the land, and then, it was people's farmland, and they were claiming it by eminent domain to take the minerals out of it, and they would just make a huge mess of it, and they'd pollute the rivers while they were doing it. And the church is saying, no, they're not only responsible for economic effects, but also for the ecological effects. Profits are necessary for businesses, and the church says that. They have to make a profit because they have to assure the future. They have to be able to reinvest it to grow an industry, to be able to hire people so that they can take care of their families, but not at the cost of the good of persons. You can't, right? It's this thing about tension, right? Yes, make a profit, but no, don't do it by, putting child labor into making tennis shoes for 14 hours a day. The worker's duty, right? Even the workers of businesses have duties, the states have duties, the workers have duties. They are to work conscientiously, competently, and with dedication. And if they don't, then they're breaking the seventh commandment. When they get into a situation where they don't feel that they're being treated fairly, the church says that, first of all, they should make every effort to negotiate a fairer outcome, but that they do have a legitimate right to a nonviolent strike if they can't get benefits that are proportional to their work. And it says the workers have to take into account the common good. So for instance, if you worked in a big electrical power plant and you decided you didn't think that you were getting fair benefits, the church would say, no, you can't go into a nonviolent strike and cut off electricity to everybody, because in doing so, the common good, right? You're going to kill possibility of killing people who need electricity for ventilators, for a heart, for intensive care units in hospitals, for all the food that would be ruined by no freezers, refrigerators. The church says, no, you have to look at the common good when you think about a strike. It has to be nonviolent, can never use violence to do it. And mostly you should just negotiate. Then the Catechism talks about, well, how could nations break the seventh commandment? It talks first about the justice and solidarity that needs to be there among nations, that we, in especially the industrialized world, need to work to eliminate or reduce poverty, inequality of resources and economic potential, economic and social injustices, the exploitation of persons, the accumulation of debts by poor countries, right? It used to be in the Old Testament that every 50 years, you had to return all the land, even if you bought it from somebody else, to the hereditary owners of that land, and you had to forgive all the debts. It was impediments to the development in less advanced countries. We have a tendency in the developed world to want to go into undeveloped countries, not to raise them up to some standard nearer our level, but in South Africa to take their minerals and diamonds, in other parts of Africa to take their oil, not to go out and it's always this iffy playing field, because at the same time that you're trying to make sure that you're raising them up to some standard, that you're not trying to impose your culture on their culture. And again, the church is like, yes, we know it's tricky, and it's never going to be perfect because of original sin. We'll never get this one big happy world, but we have to work towards it. Christians are called to participate in political and social life, which, I think a lot of us who are Christians now want to get as far away from politics as we possibly can. I'm just thinking of Gene Parks, who's such a noble character. He's been Monroe County's, or our little part of Melrose, as I should say, our district representative for the GOP. But, he's getting older, and he said this year at the caucus, I can't do this anymore. I'm giving it up in December. I need a volunteer, somebody to, and he said it just takes a couple days out of the year, and you just run into Albia, you just go to one meeting, and then you have to come to this right here, what I'm doing right now. Nobody volunteered to take it. I saw him the other day. I said, Gene, anybody volunteer to take your job? No, nobody wants it, right? And that's a problem. That's a problem for both parties. I mean, it's, and I always tell my friends, I have many friends who are Republican, I have many friends who are Democrats, and I always tell them after I vote, regardless of which party I vote for, I always feel like I need to cut my hand off. And that's not really for every single politician, but for many of them, I do. I have to vote, but I don't always like it. We're supposed to, we the laity, animate the temporal realities with Christian spirit, to witness to the gospel, to be agents of peace and justice. We're supposed to order the world's goods to God and to fraternal charity. That's our role as the laity. Last but not least, the Catechism talks about preferential love of the poor. Well, why do we have to give them preferential love? Well, because Jesus did. He said, whatever you have done to the least of my brethren, you have done to me. And if we go on in Matthew 25, and read this long section from verse 31 to 36, Christ says that we are going to be judged by what we have done for the poor. And that, first he starts out this whole conversation by saying, well, of course you'll be saved because you fed me when I was hungry, and you clothed me when I was naked. You gave me shelter when I had none. And these people that he's talking to are like, Jesus, we never did any of those things for you. And that's when he tells them, that when you do it for one of the least of my brothers, you have done it for me. And that's where we get what we call the works of mercy. What is it that we're going to be judged on at the end of time? Well, we've got spiritual works. Did we instruct the ignorant? Did we counsel those who were downcast? Did we give comfort to those who were sorrowing? Did we forgive those who sinned against us? Did we bear wrongs patiently? Did we, bodily wise, did we feed the hungry? Did we shelter the homeless? Did we clothe the naked? Did we visit the sick and the imprisoned? Did we bury the dead? All right, you don't have to do all of those things, but you have to do some of them. And in your life, God will show you which of them you are supposed to do. All right, some of them, yes, you will always do. Bear wrongs patiently, forgive. We all have to be forgiving, right? But these are tough. The works of mercy, they're tough. But Jesus didn't say that the gate was wide open to heaven, right? He said the gate is narrow. It's difficult, that we do need to strive to be perfect like our Heavenly Father. And that we always have to be thinking in our minds about what are the instructions that Christ left us with, and what are the examples that he gave in his life, and how in this very imperfect world that's affected by original sin, do we try to live out what he's asking of us. And ultimately, thank God, he is merciful and he knows we fall down a million times, but we get back up a million times and we try it again and we try to do it better. And so next week, first of all, just a couple nuggets. The love of money is the root of all evil. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. This is Jesus Christ himself. You cannot serve both God and mammon. These are things that commonly affect me, that I have to remember these words, because it's very hard to give things up once they become mine. They're like my vegetable soup. I don't want to let them go. Next week, we are going to do paragraphs 521 through 533, which will cover the last 3 commandments. And then I think what we're going to do, I'm going to talk with you guys next week about it, to see if you want to do we have one last section of the catechism to do. It's only 3 lessons, but I sense that everybody is getting very tired this year, and we can easily do those last 3 lessons next year. So put on your thinking caps. We don't have to make that decision this week, but think about that, and we will talk about it next week. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to tell you again how much I love you and appreciate you for being here with me, and just to thank God for getting us through this lesson and for teaching us about what it means when we say thou shalt not steal. So I will see you guys all next week. We love you, Jesus. Thanks for being with us.